Hello. So, for my book assignment, I read Following Ezra, which is a memoir about autism spectrum disorder. And I wanted to read a book about autism because in a future career, I hope to work with children with autism. So, I wanted to read something that would give me a little bit more insight into what it was like to live life on the autism spectrum, as well as what it was like to be the parent or caregiver of a child with autism. Many of my preconceptions about autism come from personal experience and observations. So I had a friend growing up whose younger brother had autism, and he was for the most part unable to communicate. And then I had a coworker more recently who also had autism, and he was pretty high functioning. And he really excelled at repetitive, well-defined tasks. So, some of the characteristics I observed in both of those individuals were impaired social functioning, a lack of communication, trouble with eye contact, and from time to time behavioral issues. So, Following Ezra is a story written from a father's perspective about raising his son, Ezra, who's a little boy with autism. And it tells Ezra's story from the time of his diagnosis at 3 years old all the way up until his 13th birthday. And on the screen here, I have a quote from the first therapist that Ezra's parents sought advice from when he was just 3. And it says, "You have to let yourself grieve for the child he didn't turn out to be." And this moment really strengthened Ezra's father's resolve to love his son unconditionally, no matter who he turned out to be, as well as always follow his path and follow his lead in life, no matter where that may take them. So, some of the early warning signs that Ezra's parents observed were a lack of communication, a lack of affection, lack of social interaction as a toddler, as well as many repetitive patterns of behavior and fixations, such as lining toys up in the same way day after day, things like that. So, in addition to describing many of the behavioral characteristics Ezra experienced, the story really tells about the challenges and obstacles that Ezra was able to overcome as a result of a loving family who had access to all of the right resources and interventions to help Ezra thrive and really be the best that he could be. So Ezra's symptoms and experiences align pretty well with the textbook and what we learned about in class. He experienced some restrictive and repetitive patterns of behaviors and fixations, as I just mentioned. He had a lack of social skills and kind of a general lack of interest in social interaction. He often preferred to play by himself at school. He had poor communication. He also exhibited echolalia, which is repeating the last word or phrase of a question instead of answering the question, which Ezra did frequently. And he also had a kind of lack of age appropriate fear and engaged in many risky behaviors. So, this book didn't really change my conceptions as much as it just provided further insight into the conceptions I already held. And I think most notably, it was an example for me of the positive outcomes that are possible for individuals with autism. And one kind of final point I wanted to touch on was I often hear an argument about, whether autism should really be considered a disorder, because after all, some people with autism are very high functioning. And this memoir really doesn't treat autism as a disorder. Ezra's father sought to love him unconditionally, no matter who he was. And throughout the whole story, nobody really thought of Ezra as disordered. So I think for me, the biggest takeaway from this book was not all who are different or disordered, and our differences are what make each of us unique. And I think whether it's autism or, you know, any other psychological disorder, disability, I think that is a very important message to take away from this book and apply to anybody who's a little bit different than we are. So thank you for watching.